Hi everyone, it's Lauren, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I've read so far in the month of December. As always, all of these will be linked in the description box below if you find any of them particularly interesting. So let's start. I'll do them in the order I read them. I don't know why I even thought about which book I should start with. But the first one I read in December was The Stolen Bicycle by Wu Mingyi. This has been translated from Mandarin Chinese and Taiwanese by Daryl Sturg, and it's a story of a young man who's kind of looking back on his life, and the sort of vehicle, no pun intended, through which he's looking at this is his father's bicycle. So essentially his father went missing when he was younger, or decided to go missing, decided to leave, and took his bicycle with him. Our narrator believes that if he can just find this bicycle, then he could find what happened to his father. So through this journey of remembering his father's bicycle and how important it was to the family, he searches back, he gives us a history of bicycles in general, different brands of bicycles in Taiwan, and he meets different characters, each of whom may have a connection with this specific bicycle, or may have stories of their own, of bicycles within their family. And he's sort of going back through history, and we look through such a huge range of events, of like the Japanese during World War II in Taiwan and in Burma. And it is fascinating. I think it's been translated very well, and it really comes across. I think for me, there was a gap, not in translation, but just in historical knowledge, and that's my fault, you know. So I don't really know very much about the Japanese side of World War II. I certainly don't know very much about Taiwan, and when people talk about locations, etc., you know, if you don't have that history yourself, it's quite difficult to put different people's experiences into wider context. So that was good in a way. It made me feel like I wanted to learn more about that side of the war. I did also feel like the different stories from all these different characters that we're meeting did almost become confusing in just how many different aspects there were. There's a young girl telling the story of her mother who used to make collages out of butterfly wings, and then they talk about how you would harvest a butterfly in order to make this art, which is quite an interesting aspect. It talks about people in the Burmese jungle using elephants and how they were used within war, and then it links that back to elephants in the zoo. There's a few different explorations of the traumas of war, especially traumas between sort of sons and their fathers when their fathers have been to war, and sort of have this knowledge or understanding that their children don't. And through all of it, it's examining how important the bicycle is to this history and how Japanese soldiers used bicycles in warfare. He talks about the different words for bicycle in the different languages. Like this, it's so rich. And I imagine if you were Taiwanese, Chinese, Japanese, whatever, if you had some of that history yourself, you would get so much from this book. And it's just a shame that I felt like I couldn't get so much from that. And the fact that there were so many different stories, it felt like it was difficult to follow sometimes or remember some of the different themes that were talked about earlier in the book. But overall, it was really enjoyable. It felt like quite a relaxed read. I didn't read it very quickly. But it just felt like something that I enjoyed going back to. Then the next thing I picked up was quite a different feel, and that was The Confession by Jessie Burton. And I absolutely flew through this. I got really invested in the characters, and very, very much enjoyed it. We've got a dual narrative, a dual history happening within this book. So one of these stories is set back in the 80s, and it's about the relationship between these two women, Elise and Constance, who is much older than her and an author. And sort of how that relationship developed. And then back in the present day, we have Rose, who is the daughter of Elise, and has no idea where her mother is. She's never met her, and her father just gives her a little bit of information about her mother and this woman, Constance, who she used to have a relationship with. So you're sort of finding out what happened back in the 80s, and then also you're seeing Rose struggling with her current life. She seeks out Constance and pretends to be somebody else and starts working for her in order to try and find out more about her mother and to see what really happened when she was born. The relationships in here I think are particularly well written, like between friends, like parents and children and relationships. I feel like you really got how kind of messy love can be in its different forms. And she looks at lots of different themes in here of guilt, of kind of relationships, but also parental relationships, where Constance is quite a lot older than Elise, so she feels responsible for her in many ways. So you get this kind of sense of mother-daughter between lots of different characters. And it's really kind of delving into the fact of how you work out who you are, whether your past defines who you are. Can you have a fresh start? It's very character driven, very plot driven. Right up until the end, you want to know what happened, and you really want to understand like where Elise is, like how it came to be that she had a daughter, and like how things ended with her and Constance. Like right up until the very end, I really wanted to understand what had happened. And you just really felt for Rose throughout all of this. So I would really recommend this book, especially if you're looking for something character driven, something you can really just like lose yourself in and immerse yourself in the writing. Then I think this one's for you. Next, I listened to an audiobook, which is This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay, Diaries of a Junior Doctor. And I've heard many things about this book. It came out a couple of years ago. And I thought it'd be a really good one to listen to because it is actually read by Adam Kay himself. This is just heartbreaking, basically. It's the story of his career as a doctor, as a junior doctor, which I didn't realise basically applies to anyone who isn't a consultant. So he was a doctor for, I think, like 6 years, for a really good amount of time, and got to the point of senior registrar, I think, just before you would become a consultant before he quit. And this book takes the form of excerpts from his diaries that he had to keep right from when he first qualified as a doctor through all the different ranks of like house officer, registrar. And his specialty is in obs and gynae, so a lot of it can be quite funny about some of the things that people put up themselves, and then equally some of it is very heartbreaking when there are complications with women giving birth. But mostly you just get the feeling of what utter sacrifice it is for a doctor to be working for the NHS, and it's just mind-blowing because you know that people have to work night shifts, you know that the shifts are very long, but you just don't really understand how much it impacts on their social lives. I didn't realise how often, like constantly, doctors just work for free past their contracted hours. Like everyone in a hospital, I'm sure, not just doctors, nurses as well. But there just aren't enough people, and they can't leave because people will die if they leave. And you just can't believe, like reading it firsthand, like how long people's shifts are. The fact they have to go from working nights for a couple of weeks to working days, like just straight away flip your body clock, and how dangerous that is really when you've been working for so long overnight without any sleep. Your attention is very low, and in a medical situation, it completely baffles me that we've come to accept this as the norm and that that's okay. And overwhelmingly, you just get a sense of just the sacrifice and the duty and just the passion that people that work for the NHS have to do a job like that for not very much pay and for not very much thanks, and to work so hard. It's just completely awe-inspiring. I would really, really highly recommend it because it's also very funny. I would add that in. Adam Kay writes really well. He's got this very gallows humour, dry wit aspect to him, like when he's talking about different patients he has to deal with, and it has a really good mix of it being realistic and hard-hitting where it needs to be, and also very funny as well when you look at the eccentricities of the great British public. So yeah, I couldn't recommend this more actually, especially now. Let's not talk about politics, but let's talk about politics very quickly. Especially now, let's just all appreciate our NHS, shall we? And finally, for the first part of this month, I read Your House Will Pay by Steph Char. Now, this is looking at the aftermath of the LA riots in the early 90s. It's a fictionalised characters, fictionalised families that we're following, but it's based on real events. So in 1991, a 15-year-old black girl, Latasha Harlins, was shot in a convenience store by an older Korean woman who didn't go to jail for this murder. And that event, combined with the footage released of police beating up Rodney King, caused riots around LA, particularly targeting Korean families. And what this book does is imagine an extremely similar event with a young girl called Ava, and looks at what would happen now, like to those families. So like the family of Ava and the family of the Korean woman who shot her, and it's like linking those events back in the 90s with the kind of Black Lives Matter movement now, and it examines all these different aspects of justice, of racism, in all its different forms, and it's looking at the different levels of responsibility different people might have in terms of dealing out justice, or in terms of apologising or forgiving or whatever. Like these events ripple through generations. It's not just the people who were involved at the time. And this is really interesting because I had heard of Rodney King. I had not heard of Latasha Harlins, and I didn't really understand about the LA riots. I didn't know very much about that. So this was, yeah, really enlightening for me to understand about that community at that time. It's obviously very, very poignant when it comes to looking at what's happening in America still, even now, like 20 years later. So for that, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very good the way it picked out the repercussions for everybody across the different families, across the different generations. And I particularly liked how it examined people just pick up on causes in order to kind of further themselves. How when something goes wrong for various characters in this book, it's all over Twitter immediately with people making judgments. Videos are all over YouTube, and people who aren't even involved in the events decide to stand for certain sides in order to make themselves feel self-righteous. It also looks at people who come to Black Lives Matter rallies and counter-protest, and so I really liked that aspect of it, of how it's a personal family tragedy that's actually happening to people, and how the rest of society just jumps on this bandwagon, and how easy with social media it's easy to do that, and to reduce these complex issues into like one statement, or like you're racist and that's the end of it, or whatever. And there's really a lack of nuance and a lack of empathy for the people really involved, and I think this book handles that really well. And it's also looking at like the concept of fault and who should pay for something, and like when have you paid for your crime, like at what point is it okay? And it's kind of comparing this woman who got off for shooting a young girl to a lot of the black men who just get sent to jail, like, you know, for committing a crime, but the amount of time you would spend in jail, depending on the crime you've done, like what value is there in the life. I am just rambling, but it's because like the more I'm thinking about it now, the more I'm realising there is in this book. So I'd really recommend it. It's very interesting. So that's me so far in December. I probably won't do another wrap up at the end of the year, because I will be doing videos on my best, worst, most disappointing, most surprising books that I've read over the whole year. So that will be coming for the rest of December, and I guess in January is when I will look at what else I've read for the rest of this month. Don't know how much I will read because it is Christmas and it's party season, but you know, we'll see. I'm really hoping when it gets to the end of the year, I kind of feel like I just want to get one banger in there. There might be my favourite book of the year that I just haven't read yet. So I'll try and squeeze in a couple more before the end of the year. So I'd love to hear what you've been reading this month, and let me know if you've read any of these, any thoughts that you have on them, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!